also, I want to thank Abiel Dieng for putting this together. That message is a reminder to you and to me that we are being recorded. So I just thought that I better inform you of that. So we are recording this session. Um, yeah, a few words about the series that this belongs to. This is our second event in the Berkeley Africa Current Events series. Um, our aim at the Center for African Studies is to create a kind of a hub for research in Africa. And the idea of this series is that it responds in real time to the latest political developments in Africa. And so I hope this is the first of many such events. And I hope that you will keep your eye on the website and for the messages that you've received online and from other publicity about future events in this series. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce my colleague and fellow director, Dr. Duncan Omanga, who is going to lead us through this conversation and introduce the panel and introduce the topic for us. Duncan, please go ahead.
Thank you, James, and thank you for your kind introduction. Yeah, before I talk about our panelists, I'll just give a brief background, of why we're talking about Tanzania today, on this topic of electoral carnage, what's next for Tanzania's democracy and nationhood. We all know what happened after and on October 29th. It shocked the world. Um, oh, Chipo, there you are. Sorry.
Sorry, I couldn't find my link for the webinar. I'm so sorry. I've been
No
late
worries. No worries.
to
You're
the
good. You're good. You're
pits
not
of
too late.
my computer.
All right. You're good. So we were just starting.
Okay.
Yeah. So what happened on October 29th may have shocked the world, but for observers and some, the experts who are here, this was probably not surprising. So in the lead up to elections, we know that Tundu Lissu is still in prison. Uh, Chadema was disqualified from running, as well as ACT was Alendo. Luhaga Mpina was also disqualified. Many of all opposition candidates were disqualified, and we know the guys who were running against Madame Sulu were just also runs who were planted there. And prior to that, the civic space was severely restricted. The media is still gagged, very completely obedient media in Tanzania. Civil societies in the country are severely weakened, and most of the civil societies that are really doing a great job are outside the country. And prior to that, I mean, there was a catalog of everyday violence. We talk about abductions, disappearances, torture, and stuff like that were already mainstreamed and a factor of everyday quotidian experience in Tanzania. So on election day, Madam Suluhu claimed to have won with 97% of the vote. And today, of course, those of you who are following Tanzanian politics a few hours ago, she doubled down on that 97%, and said, it was a legitimate win and all that. On election day, the internet was shut down for 5 days. And when it was finally restored, we got a glimpse to see the horrors that Tanzanian citizens who just wanted to vote went through. There were shootings in people's houses. There were we saw pictures of mortuaries with bodies packed up. We saw evidence of systematic killings, especially in major urban areas. And there were also reports that are fairly credible of mass graves, and as well as hundreds of families who are still haven't seen their loved ones to this day. Yet today, to this day, the government has yet to issue a death toll, yet to acknowledge that there were systematic pattern of killings. The government is doubling down, as I've said, blaming the victims, blaming the parents who allowed their young men to go to the streets. The government is very desperate to move on. They've set up a commission of sorts to try and, bring closure to this thing. And the question that I would want to ask our panelists and all of us are asking is, how did we get here? How did Tanzania, an island of peace, get here? This is a country we all admire for its stability, and an example to many countries in Africa. How did we get here? And after all this carnage, after all the violence, usually after such political violence, there's either more reforms or more repression. And we are seeing both of these play out. where are we headed to? What is the path forward? What is the end game? How does Tanzania get itself out of this crisis? Because this is something that it has to do. In as much as we are seeing the government wanting to put its head in the sand, they can't. They have to face this thing head on. Anyway, thankfully, I'm not. I will not be. I will not be one of the people to um, flesh this out. We have a wonderful list of panelists here who are going to lead us into this discussion. We have Konstantin Manda. He's a political scientist at UC Irvine. He studies political behavior. He's a Tanzanian national. We also have Michaela Collard, is a political scientist, a lecturer at University of Manchester. She studies legislatures in Tanzania as well as Uganda and does work on the dynamics of protests, urban protests in Tanzania. We also have Tito Magoti, is an international human rights lawyer, one of the leading voices in civil and human rights in Tanzania. And at one point had been detained for slightly more than, was it more than a year or something like that, under the late President John Pombe Magufuli. And so it's a pleasure to have you here, Tito. We have Chipo Dendere, who is also a political scientist and has done plenty of work on political party survival, looking at dominant party politics, especially in Zimbabwe, from Wellesley College. And we are happy to have you here with us. And without much ado, I want to invite Konstantin to just, help us flesh out those three questions in no particular order. You're welcome, Konstantin.
Thank you so much, Ben. I just wanted to take a few minutes of your time, 10 to 15 minutes, to kind of contextualize it, especially for those listeners and viewers who do not know enough about Tanzania. So I just wanted to take some time to kind of give the kind of historical context and then particularly the situation on October 29th. Duncan, just confirm if you're able to see the screen. Okay.
You're good.
Yeah, so just to let everybody know, Tanzania is a union between the mainland, which it used to be called Tanganyika, and Zanzibar, which has about 2 million of the 67 million. And the union began in April of 1964. Tanganyika was subsumed within the union government, while Zanzibar remains semi-autonomous with its own presidency and legislative body. The first multi-party elections in Tanzania were held in Tanganyika in 1962, which the ruling TANU, the Tanganyika African National Union, which is the precursor of the CCM today, Chama cha Mapinduzi, and then there was a revolution in Zanzibar in January of 1964, and then 3 months later, the union happened. One-party elections then proceeded from 1965 to the last election in 1990, which was the one-party system. And then there was a commission that was convened to discuss how Tanzania would enter multi-party democracy. Many of the recommendations that were made by that commission that would have expanded democratic space in Tanzania were ignored or outright antagonized by the ruling party. And this is the era we're in today, since 1995 to the most recent election. Just to kind of contextualize for folks, President Samia is the sixth president in this line of ruling party leaders, beginning with Julius Nyerere, who basically presided over Tanzania from 1961, before it was a republic, as prime minister, all the way to 1985, when he handed over to Ali Hassan Mwinyi. Samia is only the second Zanzibari. Now, Zanzibaris may also reject this, but Ali Hassan Mwinyi, the second president, was also somebody who had ancestry from Zanzibar. The current moment really can be contextualized beginning with the Ujamaa policies led by Nyerere in post-independence Tanzania that included one-party rule, nationalization of private enterprises, and resettlement of rural populations into these planned villages, which were mainly implemented between 1970 and 1981. These policies also included political education at the primary school level among these villages. Tanzanian economist Amit Morjaria, who is currently at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology Sloan School of Management, and Ruth Carlitz, a very good friend of mine, and co-authors in their most recent November 2025 Review of Economic Studies article, discuss the impacts of Ujamaa. And particularly, they find that exposure to these villagization program created higher identification with the nation rather than ethnicity. This is an effect, a set of effects that are widely celebrated by social scientists, including UC Berkeley's own Ted Miguel in the econ department in his very famous World Politics Tribe or Nation article, what Kenyan intellectual Ali Mazrui called Tanzaphilia. This very immense love for Tanzania by donors and international communities, and many, many intellectuals, in particular in the West. What they also find, unfortunately, and this could help contextualize the current moment, is that the exposure to Ujamaa makes Tanzanians more likely to respect state authority, more likely to support one-party rule, more likely to see the government as your parent, more likely to trust government newspapers, more likely to trust government TV or radio, and they're less likely to hold government accountable. Including less likely to trust other ethnic groups. So even on this dimension that Tanzanians pride ourselves on, which is the kind of national identity and a rejection of ethnic identity, Ujamaa is really an important treatment to understand. More particularly in the current context of intergenerational bargaining for political space, political freedoms, you see that in the article, in the research, they show that folks, so on the x-axis here are the years of birth. So 1948 to 51 is the oldest generation in their data, and then those born in 1984 to 1987. So everybody born from 48 to about 1965 would be classified as the baby boomers generation. 65 to about 81 or so, 80, 85, 81 would be considered Gen Xers, and then millennials afterwards. And you can see that the effect of Ujamaa, this effect of trusting the government, this effect of supporting one-party rule, this effect of being less likely to hold government accountable is really concentrated on the boomers and Gen Xers. And to some extent, you know, it kind of starts declining by the time, for example, I am born as a millennial in Tanzania. You start to see this effect decline. Now, this is going to matter later on when I discuss the kind of generational situation. So let's just jump right into the October 29th. As you can see, this is an image sourced out of Bloomberg News, where you see young men destroying and disrupting an electoral polling station, grabbing ballot boxes, and so on. And President Samia, even in her recent remarks a few hours ago, claims that this does not delegitimize the election because they, you know, basically everybody who voted had already voted before noon when the unrest began, which is questionable at best. The other thing I wanted to discuss is the national nature of these protests. We have had protests before in Tanzania, including national protests. They have not been as intense as they have been and as widespread as they've been. This is from the ACLED dataset, the Armed Conflict Location and Event datasets, which are almost certainly undercounting the extent of the violence because they require immense amount of documentation before they're able to classify these events as corroborated. But you can see, you know, a lot of the events happened in Dar es Salaam here by the coast, but there were also protests in Arusha, in the Lake Zone, in Mara, in Mwanza. You had protests as well in the Southern Highlands in Beira. And although it's not shown in this data set, but there were also protests in Dar es Salaam. And you can see that this is not just some kind of cyclical situation. It really ramps up around the October 29th date. And just looking at repression events over the past month in Tanzania, you can see a lot of it, the majority of it is violence against civilians. This is not something new for Tanzanians, but I just wanted to contextualize it for those who may not be aware. The other is this kind of intensity of the violence itself that the state perpetuated against its citizens, is this kind of shoot to kill situation. Here you have three examples that I pulled out of the data. All of these fatalities are recorded in Dar es Salaam, but there are plenty of fatalities elsewhere in Tanzania as well. And as the so-called independent commission to investigate what happened in this response of the government, we expect, I hope, that the commission will finally give us the data on how many fatalities, how many injuries, and the extent to which. But already you can see the exposure of citizens. I mean, 500,000 citizens alone, based on the violence in the Tazara intersection of Dar es Salaam, the Tanzanian-Zambia Railway, where it begins its journey from Dar es Salaam into Zambia. You can see 500,000 people. This is unprecedented in Tanzania's history. And unfortunately, when you look at the ACLED data set in the last month, Tanzania has the sixth most amount of violent events. I mean, we're more violent than the United States. It's quite shocking to be in the company of such countries that have consistently or more commonly experienced violence that Tanzanians are now starting to experience themselves. I wanted to go briefly to kind of motivate the discussion that I know Chipo, Michaela, and Tito will also enrich greatly, is to talk about the potential causes. So including, for example, the electoral manipulation of the ruling party, evidence of cheating of data that I've looked at, and then talk about this kind of generational and the use of technology by these younger Tanzanians. So the first thing, when we look at the candidate space in Tanzania, even in the most recent election, as Duncan has said, Tundu Lissu, the opposition leader from Chadema, Chama cha Demokrasia and Maendeleo, the party of democracy and development in English, still is in jail, remains in jail, facing treason charges, which comes with the death penalty. Now, of course, Tanzania, ironically, has not executed people on the death penalty since, I think, the 1990s, even though the government is not by any mean squeamish about killing its own citizens. The second largest opposition candidate was barred from the presidential race. Now, the ruling party will claim that this came from an internal dispute, but as we know, part of the rule book of the CCM includes sabotaging, kidnapping, and other coercive involvement to scatter the political opposition leadership over time. There is no unaffiliated political candidacy, which is one of the things that an earlier attempt to reform the Constitution really focused on. One of the things that they focused on is to have the ability of anybody in Tanzania to run for political office without having to be a member of a political party. The famous opposition leader, Reverend Christopher Mtikila, the late, successfully litigated this in court all the way to the High Court of Tanzania. He eventually did lose in the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals made an argument that Michael Lofke of UCLA argues in his 2020 article is completely nonsensical, because it argues that the situation should be resolved in parliament. And that opens the door for a parliament to, for example, reform the limit on the presidency to 2 terms, because that also is a political issue. Mtikila was arguing on constitutional grounds in that case that the Constitution guarantees Tanzanians' rights to associate with anybody that they want, and by symmetry, they have the right to disassociate themselves with a political party if they need to. This is, again, when the ruling CCM complains that the protesters and the protest movement is not using the right avenues in trying to deal with its grievances with the state, it's incredibly disingenuous, because plenty of Tanzanians have tried to use the legal system within which, in many cases, they've won, and the government still does not reform. This includes, for example, the recent example of Rebecca Gyumi of the Msichana Initiative, who took the government successfully to court against the Marriage Act, which allows girls to be married at a younger age than boys, arguing once again on constitutional grounds that the Constitution guarantees protections of equality by sex, and the government has yet to still implement that ruling. When you look at the voter space, of course, there's always been intimidation, threats of and actual use of violence, including, unfortunately, my brother Tito, who's experienced some of this violence. As we've seen from the report from the Southern African Development Community, SADC, reporting of observations of ballot papers being stuffed together, suggesting that they were stuffed into those ballot boxes. We also, as we note, the Electoral Commission claims that Samia won 31,913,866 votes. When you look at the National Bureau of Statistics national census data from 2022, this would constitute 93% of Tanzanians. Now, she's recently doubled down as of a few hours ago, claiming that this amount is only of the people who voted. But even if it's only of the people who voted and not the whole of Tanzania, this would constitute 93% of Tanzanians who are at least at the age of 18 and above. And yet the Electoral Commission claims that turnout was 87%. So there again, you can see some evidence of manipulation and really the disrespect of Tanzanians to imagine that we would believe such results. As of this morning, I checked, the Electoral Commission's website has yet to publish the parliamentary electoral results. If they claim that they have political legitimacy from this election, why are they not releasing the full parliamentary results? Even on the presidential results, there are only 19 constituency results posted on the Electoral Commission's website, of which I used to try and analyze statistically evidence of tampering of the votes. And so just as an example, I looked at, for example, the tallies that Samia got in the 19 constituencies that they've published. And I'm using this idea called Benford's Law, which is the idea that humans, in trying to fake data, will overuse the first digit and then declining all the way to the ninth digit when they're kind of trying to forge numbers. And this is just on the first digit of a number. So if the number is 255, you're looking at the number 2, the digit 2 there. And then I basically compare this Benford's Law both visually and statistically to see how it matches to this kind of statistical assumption. And as you can see, the data from the recent election in Tanzania matches almost exactly. Now, in statistics, of course, nothing is exactly perfect, but the statistical tests confirm that the data that they've released from these 19 constituencies match what you would expect from a kind of Benford's Law set of assumptions, at least on the first digits of the tally. I also took a look at whether these tallies are deviate from randomness. Given that we operate on a 10-digit system from 0 to 9, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 to 9, we could take a look and see how likely is it that this data is random or non-random. And in particular, we're going to compare to what we would expect from a random distribution, which would be what we would call a uniform distribution, so that each digit from 0 to 9 is equally likely to show up in the data. And what do we see from the 2025 election that got Samia elected is that we see a huge bias of the first digits for 1 and the last digit for 0, which is exactly what you would expect when there is some evidence of cheating, because human beings are very bad at producing random numbers, and they prefer ending a number with a 0 and they prefer starting a number with 1. And this is what you see. Now, I don't present here the data for the 2015 and the 2020 and earlier elections, but I can tell you that the 2015 election, for example, which I took a look at, I could not reject that the data was produced in a kind of random way, as you would expect. So the only evidence of non-random deviation is on Samia's election in the last October polls. I also took a look at particular in the first digit being 1 and the last digit being 0. And once again, I'm comparing it to what we should have expected if there was no tampering of the vote, which is the uniform distribution, which is a 10% probability for each digit. And once again, what do we see? We see that the first digit being 1 is more than 4 times more likely to be used to be recorded in these tallies than you would otherwise expect. There is a smaller bias for the last digit being 0, but once again, I compare this to the 2015 elections, which is much more random than this election, suggesting that if there is cheating, it's more likely that the 2025 election was clearly cheated rather than the 2015 election. And then, of course, as President Samia, so-called President Samia, claimed in the last few hours that the 98% that she won in this election here in the Black Series, I'm basically graphing the vote share of the winner across elections all the way from 1965 in the single party era until including the multi-party era from 1995. And you can see what she's claiming basically is popularity of the levels that Nyerere actually experienced. And just to tell the viewers, the average that Nyerere experienced over the period is 96%. So she's claiming slightly more than that. I'm also graphing the turnout here in gray. And as you can see, 87% is the highest ever turnout in Tanzania's history. The only other time where Tanzanians showed up as much to vote was in the 1980 election, where 85% are claimed to have showed up to vote. This is an incredible achievement that she's asking us to believe that she's more popular than Nyerere and that Tanzanians showed up to these polls, despite the fact that we have video and pictorial evidence that ballot boxes with ballot papers in them were destroyed by protesters, suggesting that the tally cannot be 100%. Now let's just take a look at about this issue of the youth. It's very, very interesting that the president chose to make her address earlier in the few hours with Wazee, the older generations, rather than the young generations that are claimed to be the problem. So I took a look at seeing how large have Tanzanians who are aged between 15 to 39. Now, the president in her recent remarks in the last few hours is asked people under the age of 50 to stand up in the building. This suggests that she believes people under the age of 50 are young. I have capped it at the higher end at 39. And there's a particular reason I capped it at 39 and not 35 or not anything else, because the minimum age to be a presidential candidate in Tanzania is 40, something that perhaps a constitutional reform process can perhaps discuss. So I took a look and see, okay, how large is this group? So in 1967, I went to the census data because I'm careful to make sure that I'm using government data in doing this analysis. So there's been 6 censuses in Tanzania in the post-independence period: the 1967, 1978, 1988, 2002, 2012, and 2022. On average, about 10 years where the government counts how many people there are in Tanzania. And as you can see, the age group of 15 to 39-year-olds was about 4.6 million in 1967. It's about 23.7 million in the last count in 2022. But they're not, significantly higher as a percentage of the population. As you can see, they've remained fairly stable at around 40% over the same period. Now, as a political scientist, what matters is control over physical space. Given that Tanzania has a fixed landmass, this suggests that the 23.7 are much more densely populated today in 2025 than they were in the 1960s and prior periods. The other thing that people have argued is the involvement of technology, which the government itself implicitly acknowledges by shutting down the internet, by blocking access to the social media accounts like Twitter, so-called X. And here I'm plotting in the top graph the number of mobile phone subscriptions, which were 0 in 1960, and they've gone all the way to 70.22 million mobile phone subscriptions as late as 2023. Now, given that the population is about 67 million, this suggests that there are few Tanzanians who have more than one mobile phone. So maybe this kind of very steep acceleration of the use of mobile phones can explain how this massive amounts of young people can leverage communication technology to organize protests, to communicate, despite the fact that news media can sometimes be biased. And then in the bottom graph, I'm graphing the percentage of Tanzanians who are using the internet. So it was 0% at 1990. It's 29.1% in 2023. And you can see a huge acceleration in the 2010s and the 2020s of the use of the internet. This may be something that scholars may come back to audit what happened and why young people of previous generations were either incapable or unable to protest in the same way. So I'm going to end, Duncan, here by saying that there's plenty of scholarship that can help us understand the future of Tanzanian politics. The president, in her remarks the last few hours, complained that religious leaders are meddling into politics. This seems like an indirect jab, and in some cases direct jab, towards the Catholic Church and the Episcopal Council, the Tanzania's Episcopal Council, which has made repeated comments, brave comments, bringing to light the authoritarianism of the ruling party. This is not targeting Samia, because they've done similar pronouncements even under Magufuli and previous regimes, including Mkapa, who ruled Tanzania from 1995 to 2005. Chipo, I hope, is going to talk about a fantastic book that looks at the role of ruling parties like the CCM, how they use murders and trying to push out the diaspora in ways that matters for our understanding of the future of Tanzanian politics. The president this morning, in her remarks a few hours ago, made many comments about the diaspora, about the role of the diaspora in the current protests. Michaela, I hope, is also going to talk about her fantastic book as well, that looks at the issues of the Tanzanian Bunge, the parliament, which now has basically 100% CCM members, effectively a one-party state, which we have been, as I said, basically since 1965 election, because the CCM has never really allowed full democratic space. And then, of course, my brother Tito, I hope, will give us incredible insights of the future, given amazing heroism by himself and other activists in Tanzania. So I wanna end with that, Duncan. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Konstantin. That is very, very comprehensive. And I want to quickly go to Michaela. When you see the maps that Konstantin has shared with us, showing, this urban spread of violence, showing violence at very high levels, comparing to countries at war like Ukraine, you see this blatant cheating where we now have 100% CCM in parliament. I mean, these are all areas you've been studying. And then thinking about what happened on October 29th, what comes to mind? What do you think?
Thanks very much, Duncan and Konstantin, for that wonderful presentation, context, and analysis. Speaking to this question of what explains the dynamics of October 29th, I might like to focus on, how we arrived at the protests and then how we explain the heavy security response. And the answers to those questions are closely intertwined. As Konstantin very clearly outlined, CCM has been a hegemonic party for decades. It's often held up to external audiences as this model of a dominant, highly institutionalized party in the region. But that masks a lot of internal change and crisis mitigation in recent decades, notably since the return to multi-party politics. We've seen CCM grappling with how it's going to manage the opposition, alternating between more permissive attitudes and more repressive approaches. I might pinpoint 2015 as something of a turning point there, insofar as it was the most hotly contested multi-party election to date. Konstantin's graph clearly showed this. And CCM has, since that election, really closed opposition space significantly. We saw this beginning under Magufuli, and we saw different flavors of it under Samia, with an initial kind of effort to reopen or a gesture towards reopening, and then a very definitive closure, as you have both alluded to already. So there's this sense that it doesn't quite know how to relate to the opposition, but it's now adopt this very repressive tack. Another face of these kind of challenges that CCM has faced, though, relate to its own internal politics. So again, CCM is not this static, ever-enduring institutionalized party. It has very factional internal politics at times, and it has seen significant institutional change. Again, 2015 was something of a turning point insofar as CCM saw its biggest factional defection with the exit of Edward Lowassa after a contested presidential nomination contest within the party. And we saw some of the internal space for competition closing in under the subsequent presidencies. There's a lot to dig into there, but CCM has had quite a long tradition of contested internal primaries, and we saw that beginning to erode under Magufuli and again under Samia in ways that have drawn a lot of criticism within the ruling party as well as within the opposition. So in the nominations coming up to this year's election, there was a concern that CCM members had not been able to select candidates of their choosing. There was a lot of intervention from top party organs, leaders saying, vetoing candidates, including Luhaga Mpindo, which is when he then defected to ACT to attempt to run as the presidential candidate from the opposition. So we've seen this kind of closing of, as you put it, Constantine, of the candidate space for the opposition. We've seen this kind of increasing challenge within CCM to manage its internal coalition, internal factions, and for presidential candidates, presidential nominees to consolidate their coalition. And with Samia, we saw this also taking the form of very erratic appointments to cabinet, to different party positions, various figures coming in and out, seemingly in the inner circle and then back out in the cold. And there's been this sense that she's really struggled to kind of stabilize who it is that she trusts, who is in her camp. At the same time, we've seen reforms of the security services, of TIS, efforts to rely seemingly more on security as a mode of governance. The point I really want to stress, though, coming to your question, Duncan, about the urban concentration of this violence and of the protests themselves, is more a kind of socioeconomic story of CCM's political dominance and how that's also changed over time. And I'd really like to stress the sense of a crisis of legitimacy in terms of a kind of economic consensus. What is this party offering to voters, to urban residents who can be seen as kind of more privileged, as better off than rural residents, and yet are overwhelmingly employed in precarious, low income jobs or self-employment, who are increasingly challenged by informal urban settlement and in Dar es Salaam, rapidly inflating house prices. We're seeing a lot of displacement from people from more central areas into the periphery. And we're seeing a kind of failure of the government to really respond to this effectively. Samia's administration in particular set the tone early on with mass evictions of informal operators in urban space, so Machinga, as street vendors, but this also affected motor taxi drivers, various categories of workers operating informally from the street. So that set the tone for her government, with this affecting, the numbers aren't official, but we could be talking into the hundreds of thousands. Estimates from a similar large-scale eviction at the start of Kikwete's presidency put it above 1 million. So, a significant kind of shock to an urban economy and an urban population, not just in Dar es Salaam, in Mwanza, elsewhere in the country at the very start of her presidency. And since then, there hasn't been a very clear message to urban Tanzanians about what the government is doing. There were efforts to say, if we focus again on informal operators, efforts to make overtures to designate them as special groups who might be eligible for government loans. There was a greater emphasis put on essentially government-constructed top-down associations that were meant to be representative organs for these different occupational groups, but have effectively operated as kind of disciplinary kind of patronage tools for the government. And this, has again kind of fed into a sense of a failure to respond, a significant grievance. I might just conclude with one sort of symbolic example that captures a lot of the discontent, which is relates to transport and the shift to bus rapid transit in Dar es Salaam. So this might sound really dry. We're talking urban planning, we're talking transport planning, but there's been a huge emphasis on this and on big infrastructure spending. In the years and months leading into the election, the construction of BRT across Dar es Salaam has been expedited, and yet this is a system that has been failing. There isn't the investment in actual buses. This was contracted to a UAE-based company to deliver buses that hadn't arrived. And in the weeks leading to the protests, this erupted into major protests by passengers, BRT passengers, who rely on this now as the main means of affordable transport in and out of certain key parts of the city, and yet who were just stranded. They did not have transport. The buses weren't arriving. They were overcrowded. And they started attacking the buses and chanting Hatutaki CCM, the exact same slogans, we don't want CCM, that then reemerged in the protests on election day. The sense that we are struggling. This is daily lived realities in cities where there are huge concentrations of people, including young people. What is the offer? How are we being provided for? And that's economic message really carried through into the protests, which again targeted a lot of CCM property or allegedly CCM owned property or owned by close affiliates of the party. And that kind of echoed this sense of there being a deep disconnect. It also maps onto the urban areas most active in the protests, which were places like Kimara, Manzese, Tabata, and Bagala, low-income neighborhoods where there's a heavy concentration of people in fairly informal settlements. So it raises a major challenge for the response, which has to be about accountability politically through formal institutions, but also very much in terms of what is the kind of distributive justice that CCM intends to offer. The security response suggests that there aren't answers to those questions as yet, and that it is a cover for a failure to find answers to the crisis. Samia's speech earlier today alluded to youth as lacking patriotic education, but not suffering. She argued that Tanzania is a country that does not have poor living conditions by regional standards. I think a lot of people in Dar es Salaam might be struggling, though. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Michaela. And that's a fitting segue to Tito. So Michaela talks about the issue of security response and also the issue of accountability. I know there's been a lot of discussion. What are the accountability mechanisms? And I know the civil society has been very strong on this. We've had, hints that the ICC could be interested in, trying to help with accountability mechanism and stuff like that. Of course, we know the state-sponsored judicial commission is ongoing, but you can maybe give us your take as you reflect on, some of the human rights violations that preceded even this event that might make some of these efforts look either superficial or, whatever. What's your take?
No, thank you so much, Duncan, and good to see familiar faces. My brother Manda and Michaela. Yeah, great to listen to your insights. And I almost said, so what am I gonna say after this, eloquent presentation of the actual situation, but also the understanding of the ground that they painted from history to, the history of Tanzania, the politics, the political economy, but also the situational analysis that Michaela alluded to. So for me, I will start with the question, the how did we get here? Pretty much reiterating what the previous speaker said. So for me, I think it's the fact that CCM as a party, as a political party, lost the ideological identity and started banking on the use of force, or rather banking on the utility of the law enforcement agencies and the fact that we are the ruling party, we have control and oversight of all state agencies and machineries. It is when you know, they abandon the citizens. In fact, I would trace it so many years ago, but practically from 2020, we didn't have a parliament properly so called. You cannot have a parliament with 99% of ruling party legislators. Some scholars call it an extended party caucus. And so with that representation, quote unquote, you won't have, a reflection of the citizen's voice. You would also go further to look into the quality of the deliberations in the parliament, and then you'll be like, this is just an extension of the executive. So the disassociation of the citizen from the governance architecture and the political processes sort of made it easy for CCM to relax and bank more on use of authoritarian tendencies, but also cascading the citizens and going further to, cracking down on alternative voices like the civil society organizations, the media, activists, human rights lawyers, but also paralyzing institutions of justice, including the National Human Rights Institution, which has been more of a barking dog that has no impact. And also you look at the judiciary of Tanzania, and to be fair, we have had a vibrant judicial system back in the days, especially when we had the Bill of Rights in the Constitution at first. They did quite a good job, at least for 1 decade plus, until such time when the judiciary became an extension of the executive. So the disregard of the populace, the disregard of a vote, a vote became just like a donation that you are just donating to someone to extend a day in office, which does not necessarily count. So such application of authoritarian tendencies then denied people an alternative. If you crack down on, for example, the Chadema party, which is the major, rather the main opposition political party, it means you are denying people a legitimate alternative. If you even attempt to crack down on, I always call these briefcase political parties like ACT Wazalendo, with all due respect, there might be ACT Wazalendo fanatics here. I apologize, but this is my position. So if you also go after such other alternative political parties to the extent of denying them a presidential candidate, it means you are, kind of limiting options. And then the only way to go is for the citizens themselves to be at the center of the political conversations. And this is what exactly happened in Tanzania. Then, so what does this mirror in terms of human rights? You intensify crackdown, you intensify application of authoritarian tendencies, you then lose the plot amongst the citizens because you have done with all these other formal institutions like political parties, NGOs, the media, the church, religious institutions, the academic. We may never have this. I mean, we would never have this conversation. The University of Islam, sadly, or another, vibrant institution of higher learning. So when you crack down all of this, it means now you are remained with the citizens only. Um, and whoever raises their voice, it's when you also realize that I need to deal with this. And some of us were fortunate enough to gain the presidential appointment to spend some times in jail. Um, my brother Tundulisu has also been appointed to spend time in jail, but also they consume, they eat us, they crack us down, and then once they are done with us, they also go for some of their own. We now have cases of Ambassador Humphrey Polepole, Gwajima, Bishop Gwajima, and more other who were disgruntled with the January CCM primaries process, which saw Samia as the only presidential candidate in a very suspicious process. So I would say that the trickle-down effect shifts from the main, you know, I wouldn't say the main victim, but rather the main actors or the people in the mainstream, all the groups, the democratic actors, to the citizen themselves. And that's when you are writing your own, you're writing your own end of story. You're writing the end, the last chapter of the book, if I put it that way, because governance is meant to be of the people, for the people, and by the people in a democratic setting. So that's the situation that mirrors Tanzania. All said and done, you have the people who are disassociated from governance, but then you have the effect of utilization of authoritarian tactics and tendencies, and then you have all institutions of governance paralyzed.
Thank you, Tito. Thank you, Tito, for that take and very, very impressive and overview of we know the human rights situation that preceded these events was catastrophic, and I want to come to you, Chipo, as you reflect first of all on the work that you did on the book, and we are looking forward to see the launch of that book next spring at UC Berkeley. In today's address, Madame Suluhu talked about, she mentioned about imperialism, foreign powers, foreign interests getting, as part of, the entities that were to blame for the violence. She, of course, alluded to the role of the diaspora and all that. And of course, reflecting on your work and also reflecting on big party politics, especially the political parties that achieved independence for some of these African countries like ANC. You've worked on ZANU-PF a lot. We know CCM considers itself as an independent party. There's also the close links to it wants to mirror the Communist Party in China and stuff like that. How does all those dynamics and structures reproduce what we are now seeing?
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here and Shout out to the book, Death, Diversion, and Departure, that's coming out in January. I have links to the book on my social media. Um, in fact, as I was thinking about the book and reflecting on these remarks, one of the things I did in my early work, I took a bus from Harare all the way to Arusha. My goal in life was to understand the survival of these post-independence party, CCM included, in that ZANU-PF, ANC. And before I got to Arusha, I spent time in Dar es Salaam. When I got to Dar es Salaam, I went to the University of Dar, and there were professors there that I was talking to. And one of the things I realized is that the opposition in Zimbabwe had not been quite aware of the importance of the linkages between these political parties. So I'm talking to a professor who's very progressive, and he says to me, well, how's Mugabe? And I thought, I don't know. I don't know anything about him. And he says, well, what do you mean? Your generation has no respect. And I bring this up because of what Constantine started with, right? That there are these generational differences. For a long time, CCM, not unlike ZANU-PF, benefited from the nostalgia that a particular generation had, a generation that lived under colonialism, that saw the transition to independence, a generation that could look at them and say, but look, they're trying, right? They're trying. And then I went to Arusha, and what I thought was interesting in Arusha at the time is that the opposition was the mayoral party in Arusha. And looking at Tanzania, I thought, okay, there's something happening here. CCM, like ZANU-PF, they have their pockets everywhere. So even in Arusha, which was an opposition stronghold, you would see the flag for CCM. But in the meetings where I was seeing something quite different from what was happening in Zimbabwe at the time. You had friends from CCM and Chadema sitting with each other, having lunch, having all these debates. The other thing that I noticed in 2013 is that although Tanzania had been slow to economic growth, in 2013 we could already see a future where Tanzania was slowly building, right, towards an economy that is broader. And so the research that I've done in preparation for this, I was interested in how has the economy done? And I know that as Africanists, we are very worried about the economic arguments, right, for explaining what is happening. And I know the Tanzanians in the room, you look at me and say, well, there hasn't been that much economic development in Tanzania. But let me share some numbers with you. In 1960, the GDP per capita for Tanzania was just 2.65 billion. What struck me is that by now it's over 79 billion, right? So over the last decade and a half, something was happening in Tanzania where the economy was expanding. And for me, it was very small things that I've seen as I've traveled to Tanzania, not the fancy tourism and all of that. It's that Tanzania was one of the first countries where I witnessed solar energy being harnessed by citizens and selling it back to the grid. Now, Tanzania is very hot. Most people were not thinking about solar. When I was asking about solar, people would say, well, why do you care about solar? And I was thinking, well, because the rest of the continent is in the dark and you're not. You've got electricity. What's happening, right? So one of the things that I think happened, going back to Constantine's argument about these generations and comparing ANC and ZANU-PF, these political parties that benefit from nostalgia, the slow and incremental economic benefits in Tanzania, it's not rapid, it's not a lot, have created something for the millennials and the Gen Z. Where the millennials and the Gen Z in Tanzania are saying, we don't have nostalgia for the past. What we have is a desire for a future that is powered by the economy of Tanzania. And that is what we're demanding. Now, the old ruling parties, and Madame Slumi is taking a page from ZANU-PF. It's almost as though she studied under the feet of Robert Mugabe with blaming colonialism and neo-colonialists. And the argument is coming back and saying, you're not being grateful. Look at everything that I've done for you. Look at how you're destroying the economy. But where Tanzania is today is where Zimbabwe was in some ways in 1999, in 2000. It's very different from where Zambia was in 1991, right? In 1991, Zambia, also having been under the same political party for a long time, under Nyerere under Kaunda for a long time, the economy was actually crumbling in Zambia, like completely crumbled. The kwacha, you needed bags and bags of it. Zimbabwe in 2000 is an interesting case, and I know somebody is looking up the numbers on inflation right now. But in 2000 in Zimbabwe, you've got a young generation of a middle class, right, that can see the writing on the wall that this economy is about to fall, but they are enjoying those benefits of being in the middle class. They're young, they're educated, they're passionate, they're supporting the opposition party. The young people in Tanzania, the millennials, well, I'm a millennial, so we have to claim some credit here. The millennials and the Gen Z, they're looking and they're saying, well, look at Kenya, look at our neighbor. And I've been laughing as I've seen Kenyans saying, oh, we're the leaders in the region and the protests. And I'm saying, no. Tanzanians have been very quiet. They're not ones, Tanzanians and Namibians, they're not ones to be like the rest of us, right? Or to be like the Nigerians. Zimbabweans are quiet, but to be like the Nigerians and the Kenyans. They're not the ones to be like that. They're a quiet people, but a people that has been looking and saying, where do we go next? And now there's an opening that's happened. The fissures that Michaela mentioned in CCM, when those fissures happen in the long-serving parties, this is always an opportunity for the opposition. Now, and I think CCM could see this, right? We've seen the increase in the jailings. We've seen the disappearances. And I was just thinking of the case in 2019 that a lot of people are talking about the disappearances now, but there was a big case in 2019 where somebody was arrested and taken, and we still don't know where that person went, right? So they could see, CCM was seeing the writing on the wall that we have to take out the vocal opposition leaders because within themselves, CCM is experiencing massive fissures. What these protests have done, though, which worries me more than anything else, and this is what happened with ZANU-PF to some extent. People talk about ZANU-PF being all over the place, and it is. But every time that their fissures lead to these kinds of protests, where citizens come together, the international community comes together, and people demand change, then these ruling parties unite. They unite in a way that the opposition parties in the region have not been able to. And I think there was an opportunity here for CCM to kick out Madam President, but they didn't. And that's critical. That's something we should all be paying attention to. They could have kicked her out. They could have replaced her with somebody else, but they understand. It's not that the people in CCM like each other. These are disparate parties now. Since independence, they are coalitions. And I think somebody put this well online and said, you notice two strands of conversation in what has happened since October 2019. There are young people that are crying for a better economy, for a better situation for their families. Then there is a cohort that is crying about their property. And the cohort that is crying about their property might like democracy, might in fact want democracy, but they are going to align themselves with CCM for as long as their financial and economic interests are protected. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges of where we are on the continent, whether it is in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Malawi, in Kenya. It is that the economic classes, these super rich, and there are not a lot of them, right? These super rich, few people in our countries, right, who somehow made the money work for them. They are more concerned about their property than they are about democracy. And they will find a way to coalesce with the ruling party. So where Tanzania was headed, where you needed the middle class, right? And by middle class, I don't mean it in the American sense of rich people calling themselves middle class. I mean it in the sense of people who've got jobs like teachers and nurses and doctors, where we were getting a growth of that, or young people that want these professional opportunities and demanding change. That's been thwarted. And because CCM has not clearly fallen apart, right? And I don't think they will. I think unless the opposition has a way to continue to galvanize voters, but we're already seeing the writing on the wall with this language of it's outside people. It's not our people. It's Kenyans, it's foreigners, it's all of this, which is going to lead to isolation. It's going to, and one of the things I've been thinking about and debating is, okay, so people are saying, well, after Madam President leaves office, she needs to be taken to The Hague. She needs to be taken to the International Criminal Court. And the gendered side of me thinks, well, there are lots of African men who've done what she's done, who've never been taken there. In some ways, she's winning the game that African men set up since independence. So what do we do with her, right? What do we do? Do we think that she's going to have some reckoning? Do we think that they're going to do what Kenya and Zimbabwe did when their elections were disputed and they had a coalition government? I don't think so. I don't think so because the leaders in the region have endorsed her. They are not isolating her. And as long as the leaders in the region don't isolate her, I don't see an opportunity for a coalition government, which is what would be needed to perhaps propel Tanzania to the next level of democracy, right? You go from switching leaders to switching political parties. What I'm not sure about, and I didn't have a lot of time to look into, is how strong are the opposition parties in Tanzania to withstand what's happening right now. Because a lot of our focus has been on CCM, which makes sense. But I think our focus also needs to look at the opposition and ask ourselves, how strong are they to withstand? Do they have an opposition that can be bought out? Right? Can the opposition be bought out? I'm not talking about the protesters, the young people, where people are saying, well, they can be bought out with a few benefits. But is the opposition in a position to enter a government of national unity if one is to be put today? Right? Are they in a position to then use that to their advantage to propel Tanzania forward? And it is unfortunate what has happened in Tanzania, but it is not unexpected. Because when these liberation struggle parties, when there is an opening and their weakness is shown, they default to violence. It's literally in their DNA. They will default to violence. Any sense of the citizens speaking up, any sense that they're about to lose power, they default to violence. So I'll pause there.
Chipo, that is very sobering. Very, yeah, I mean, not very exciting news to hear that it's not easy to kick some of these guys out. Not very exciting news to hear that these independent parties are well entrenched and will resort to violence. You've raised important questions. How strong is the opposition? I have my opinion, but I wanted Tito and Tito to comment on this. And also, you've asked Chipo the question, where do we go next? And it seems the civil society in Tanzania was toying with the idea of accountability, which you mentioned. But it seems, looking at this in a gendered way, the way you've said, it seems if this is an option, then and with the endorsements that that have come from the region, some of those endorsements were a bit muted. They were not very blatant. They were very muted, and people were very shy to give those endorsements. But there's a cry for justice. What do you tell? I'm just wondering, how do you move forward with all the bloodletting that we saw in Tanzania? Can you just talk about a coalition government, given what has happened, without true reconciliation, without, with the speech that the president gave today? It's like, she was blaming the victims. She was blaming the parents of those youth. She did not take responsibility at all. And this is not the first time. There was a time she said, death is death. So I don't know. Let me not speak too much. Tito, what do you think? And then, we'll proceed from there.
No, no, thanks. And I would also appreciate insight from my brother Constantine, because sometimes I speak too much and sometimes I refrain from speaking. Well, so I think there's under appreciation of what the citizens can do. And we often encounter this, especially in our academic, scholarly NGO conversations. We tend not to appreciate where the power comes and what the united people can do, especially using the unpopular means. It's not popular to protest and tell the president that go home in Africa, or probably everywhere. But if you read our constitutional dispensations, if you read Article 8 of our constitution, it alludes to the fact that mamlaka yote ya nchi yanatoka kwa wananchi, that all powers come from the citizens. The power to rule, the power to do anything in their name comes from the citizens. So I think we may probably need to interrogate this idea of citizens being at the center of the governance architecture in all jurisdictional bonds. Two, one thing that I didn't say earlier, it skipped my mind, is what afterthoughts mean in terms of moving forward, including the commission of inquiry that you mentioned earlier. I want to respond to this before I go further. So for me, at least if for some of us think that this is an afterthought, because it was not oriented on remorsefulness, empathy, but also the fact that we have to acknowledge that we have a problem. From the get-go, there was no, a plain show of regret. And people would want to look at our president as a mama. Obviously, mama would not want to see you cry. Even if mama might beat you, but she would end up giving you food so that you feel like you are home. So that lack of human sight, properly said, is what precipitated all other thoughts that everything that she's doing is afterthoughts, having felt like there are gonna be calls for independent inquiry, and then we'll say we already have a commission in place. It has 3 months to do the job. The fact that there might be, external oversight, the Commonwealth, which in my opinion is also useless, chaired by the former Malawi president. It's one of the things that the president was trying to preempt. The intervention by the ICC, that cannot be preempted by all these other local political interventions. If at all a solid case is made and an evaluation shows that there's a prima facie reason to pursue, investigation. So, I mean, everything that came afterwards, especially after 2 weeks of not being remorseful, after all this time of not apologizing, after this time of blaming foreign elements, after all this time of blaming, the financiers of the Mandamano. I read somewhere that I also financed Mandamano. and I can't really remember if I financed any person to protest. So I said somewhere that this is a mockery and insult to the people who are mourning. And the mood of the country is such that at least I know someone who knows someone who lost someone. So in that ecosystem, you cannot propagate our feelings. You cannot manipulate us to feel like it was just a day and then life has to go on. Whether we have credible opposition, I would say yes, definitely. Tundu Lissu wouldn't be in prison if he wasn't an opposition leader, especially at a time when CCM needed more validation through the poll. They could have done that with all these other briefcase political parties. They tried without success. They wouldn't harass the entire Chadema leadership. And for the records, since April this year, the entire Chadema leadership was put under political lockdown. But also the party itself was suspended from partaking into legitimate political activities for, a suspicious case that was filed by the former Chadema leadership relating to division of party assets. So yes, I would say we have a credible position, and also all these um, the outbreak, I would say the awareness came from a campaign that was run by Tundu Lissu, that why should we go to an electoral process while the result is predetermined? Why should we allow our people to go be killed fighting for democracy that is not existent. There's no foundation for this. Why should we, allow our people to enter into a process and fight and end up in jail while we can avoid this? So we would rather say we're not going to vote, we're denying you legitimacy, and we want you on the table. And this is this is the orientation that the people had, such that they took it further to say, we are making sure that there's no election. So no reform, no election, and they managed to do that. Whether the opposition can negotiate for a government of national unity, we have a very not so distant case study from Zanzibar. It doesn't work. It has not worked, especially from the experience of our compatriots in Zanzibar. Such that the CUF, which is now the ACT, was a landlord party, has expressed misgivings in the national government unit. They don't feel like they're part of the government. You murder thousands of people, you butcher thousands of people, and then you appoint two of them to serve in a government where they don't have voice. If you are if you're the second vice president, and then you have a minister for trade and one minister for health, then what are you doing in that government? And what policies can be passed just because you have a second vice president who has no voice? So maybe GNU may not be a viable option for Tanzania. The people's demand might be the viable option, however ambitious they look. The people want a rerun of the election. They want the release of the political prisoners, release of all hostages, people who have been disappeared. They want truth and accountability amidst all these atrocities. They also want a new election management system and at least a new constitution in place. So at least there are very clear demands that would allow people to not necessarily negotiate for a deal in the government, but rather that assurance that we're in a country that we're allowed to do our business without worrying. As I finish, civil society organizations, I said earlier, we at least don't have a vibrant society as it used to be because of the repressions, but also because of the fact that post Magufuli, who is blamed a lot, and I also have a share in blaming him for authoring the authoritarian, people went to sleep and they banked much on this mama will do, let's support mama, let's rally behind mama and more. Yeah, the endorsement by heads of states in Africa is not surprising. We do not expect President Ruto to tell Samia that you're authoring a massacre because he's doing the same at home. Museveni, at least Kagame is quiet. We don't know the motive. Not surprising for Burundi, but accolades to our Southern Africa siblings. Mzee Thabo Mbeki came out very strongly. The ANC, former Botswana President Ian Khama, but also the current Botswana president. And you'd be ashamed if your fellow female president is not congratulating you after winning a landslide. So we're in a situation where I would say the people of Tanzania knows what they want, and they are likely to get what they want, whatever the cost. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Tito, for that positive, more positive outlook. Coming to Constantine, Tito has said the GNU cannot work. We know the D9, their protest planned on December 9th. The government is very worried about that. They've cancelled all celebrations, but I see online people agitating for that. Tito has talked about a possibility for a rerun and the need for reforms to move forward, which everyone agrees that were there reforms, some of these things would not happen. But is there any chance that any of this might happen in this current government?
So the president in her remarks, the so-called president in her remarks earlier today in Tanzania, speaking to these wazees of Dar es Salaam, these elderly folks of the ruling party in Dar es Salaam, suggests that if she is genuine, she claims that within 100 days she will set up a commission to discuss constitutional reform. Coincidentally, she was the vice speaker for the Constitutional Assembly the last time Tanzania attempted constitutional reform, which was sabotaged by herself and the ruling parties, despite having an amazing draft already. And then, once again, one of the things she claims, and the vice president has claimed this, the prime minister, the so-called prime minister, has claimed that there should have been other avenues to achieve this. I agree wholeheartedly with my brother Tito that a government of national unity has never, ever, especially in the context of East Africa, achieved the goals of the opposition. This was the case in Kenya. This was the case, certainly is the case in Zanzibar. So I think the opposition is likely to reject those kinds of overtures. When you think about, for example, this idea of, what can we do? So we've had very brave journalists, Duncan and everybody else in Tanzania, who have spoken out in the past, who have published written pieces, including Eric Kabendera, who has an amazing book where he discusses and details a lot of this, who have had to go to exile, some of whom have been murdered, some of whom are missing. If you say then the issue is about civil society, we have a situation where the former head of Twaweza, an NGO that is still among the list of people accused of financing, along with my brother Tito, these protests. When he and the organization he led at the time published popular survey data showing the decline in support for the Magufuli administration, his passport was taken away and accused of not being a Tanzanian, a very, very common accusation against the opposition. And he's now leading the OGP, the Open Government Partnership, globally, despite the fact that Tanzania unilaterally removed itself from the OGP in 2017 under the Magufuli administration. When you talk about legal avenues that the president may suggest maybe we should do, that too has been tried many times. As I said in my presentation, Mtikila went to court to ask for the private candidacy and won in court, including not just internally in Tanzania, but externally. Rebecca Gyumi, to this day, has not lived in a Tanzania where the government respects its own legal institutions that rule against it. So there again, if you talk about academia, we have had, as you see the president, the so-called President Samia doubling down earlier, talking about the elderly to talk to their kids. The prime minister has alluded to that we should have a national discussion starting at the family level. This betrays a lack of power in their own beliefs that they can control the narrative, despite massive amounts of propaganda, despite massive amounts of control of the communication space. And I just want to end with a kind of final thing. I was reading early this morning after spending way too many hours listening to Samia until 5 a.m. this morning. Oscar Kambona, the infamous leader of TANU, who helped build TANU under Nyerere, became basically the first permanent secretary, the lead, the main kind of personnel that led the party, who differed with Nyerere after the Arusha Declaration, which basically began the process of one-party consolidation, the Ujamaa policies, and so on. When he went to exile in the United Kingdom, this was at a huge personal cost to him. He had to do, incredibly, menial jobs in the UK. His family, his brothers were arrested at the December 9th celebrations for independence of 1971. So this was 10 years after independence. On December 9th, he infamously, from his ties with the Portuguese in Mozambique, dropped leaflets on the Saba Saba grounds in Dar es Salaam, directed towards Nyerere, talking about the abuses the lack of dissent within the party, the lack of dissent within Tanzania, and invited Nyerere to open up democratic space and that he would come back into the country to vie for the elections as well. Then and now, you had the government responding with violence, responding by arresting his brothers, later releasing them. Now, of course, at that time, the South African racist regime was also sabotaging Tanzania, including the explosion of bombs and the Salenda Bridge in Dar es Salaam. Now, the president and the ruling party and many of my relatives who are still supporting the ruling party are claiming that, supporting these protest movement is akin to civil war. Very similar rhetoric that we saw during the era where Oscar Kambona was fighting for the same democratic spaces. And once again, Samia is not an exception. This is a fundamental situation of the ruling party, as Michaela, Tito, and Chipo have said. And it suggests that the only long-term solution for the ruling party is to finally open up that space. If they go the way of KANU in Kenya and disintegrate into multiple elite networks is another question altogether. But this is something that they cannot recover from another senseless killings on the December 9th demonstrations. If the December 9th demonstrations for Independence Day this year occur, as I suspect they will, um, um, if the ruling party responds with a lot more violence, they are not they're completely going to lose this final war if they're going to kill. Because as Chipo said, Tanzanians are not Kenyans. Tanzanians are not Nigerians in some sense. They've never experienced this level of impunity that is so visibly in our faces. So there's a lot there's a lot of uncertainty, but I don't think that even in the long run they're going to survive much longer.
Michaela, Constantine thinks that the CCM is likely not to survive much longer, given the kind of levels of violence we saw, and that might be a deterrence for D9. I don't know what you think about going forward, your thoughts.
Thanks very much, and thanks to everyone for the comments. I don't want to paint bleak scenarios. So maybe I'll just focus on what's happening in the present and some things to focus on in trying to chart a path towards some kind of reform opening. Because there are, crudely, two contrasting scenarios, one where there does begin to be an opening, some form of reconciliation, and one where we see a much more securitized path, or something that kind of lurches between gestures of reconciliation and increased or ongoing repression. Part of me worries that latter scenario might well be more plausible. But I think if we focus on what's happening now, what concerns me is we're seeing this kind of lurching between, again, gestures of reconciliation and repression emerging with, on the one hand, President Samia's call for clemency and a reprieve for many of the 200 plus people arrested after the protests, some of whom have been released. We also hear, calls for understanding for youth who might have just been caught up in the crowd. At the same time, we hear that this was an opposition plot and there shouldn't be, any respect for the calls for reform. The president's own commission to investigate the protests and aftermath has been derided for bias in terms of who's appointed and the terms of reference, etc. So there's the sense that there's a searching round on the part of the government to figure out what their strategy is and how they kind of balance this crisis, appeal to different sentiments, different pressures. My fear, though, is that on the ground, there is not only continued repression of opposition, but also people's everyday lives. So if we're looking at Dar es Salaam, Again, I've been doing a lot of work with informal operators, especially in transport, including motor taxi drivers. They are now scapegoats for the protest. There's this idea that they somehow also helped organize it. And they were disproportionately targeted in cleanups afterwards. So, again, talking to contacts, friends around different neighborhoods in the days following the protests, there was this kind of crackdown, again, targeting boda drivers. Leaders of some of the associations talk about how they're now being called in by the regional commissioner, by the district commissioner of the different municipalities to go around registering boda drivers into a big database, which they all need to enter to then get an ID, which will be a requirement for buying petrol, for instance. So there's this effort to kind of expand a kind of net of surveillance and control over very everyday aspects of people's livelihoods and kind of curb any potential threat that a kind of urban lower income population might pose. And I just kind of want to focus attention a little bit on that because beyond the kind of bigger institutional reforms we might hope for, this is a kind of security response affecting everyday lives, and very much in preparation for December 19th, but also with the possibility of extending beyond that. That's very worrying for thinking about, everyday state-society relations, again, well beyond the sphere of formal institutions. But in a space where cities themselves and their population can be seen as a potential threat to the government in power. And that's a reality that I just think needs attention and a response as part of any possible reconciliation, any sense of a renewed peace, because that peace is sorely lacking for a lot of people in their sense of security and what kind of future they might, even just getting back to kind of normal everyday life, what that might look like. So yeah, the broader institutional picture, I'm would love to see a chink in some prospect for more reform. I'm very concerned that Samia's government has a track record of kind of beginning reform processes that don't go anywhere. So that also needs to be hedged against. And those are often combined with other processes that lead more towards this continued securitization. At the same time, she was pursuing reconciliation with opposition parties. She was also reforming TIS. So we need to be alive to the ways these processes can be played off each other. And what it would mean to get on a more meaningful reform trajectory. I realize I've offered no insights as to how that might happen, but just ways that it is currently a challenge.
Thanks, Michaela. Thanks. Chipo, to you now. And I know you might want to add something on what has been said here, but I know in Zimbabwe, ZANU-PF and MDC under Morgan Tsvangirai, despite ZANU-PF being an independent party, they found a way, and MDC became Morgan Tsvangirai became prime minister in 2008, and of course it was modeled under the Raila Odinga and Kibaki model that also happened around the same time. But we've heard that from Tito and Constantine that is not very possible in Tanzania. Are there ingredients that someone can work with from your own from the work that you've done and that might apply to Tanzania?
Yes. And so one of the things that I missed, and I think we haven't talked a lot about, is that while the media in Tanzania was blocked, in particular the internet and social media, the world was still able to get a record of what was happening. And I think that was really critical. So as we were speaking, I was looking up the death tolls of post-election violence in the most violent elections. For Zimbabwe in 2007, the death toll numbers that we have is that 3,500 people were killed. In Kenya, which resulted in the government of national unity, the death toll there was 1,400 people. In an election in India, the death toll was also 3,500. And in each of those cases, the very high death toll is what pushed for a government of national unity or some reform, right? But the number in Tanzania is almost double, right? I think the numbers, and the experts can correct me, but the numbers that I'm seeing online is that the death toll is at 6,000 people right now. I don't know if that's correct, but that's what I just saw. That the death toll is at 6,000. So there is an opportunity to emphasize. I mean, it is very difficult for anyone to continue governing peacefully with that number of 6,000 people dead. I watched the documentary from CNN that Larry Madowo's work has been doing. I mean, one of the saddest things about the decline in Twitter usage, and it's something I've said a lot, is that, as people celebrated academics and people leaving Twitter, they were so focused on American and European politics that we missed the fact that for African politics and other parts of the world, Twitter is a critical vehicle for letting the world know what is going on, for shaming rogue leaders. And so, in some ways, we lost that voice. The fact that 6,000 people, or whatever the number is, but it's still pretty high, died in Tanzania. And the president is allowed to operate business as normal. This did not happen in Kenya. This did not happen in Zimbabwe. And in both of those cases, we didn't even have this deep level of social media that we have. In some ways, maybe people are now desensitized to violence because they've been seeing wars on their screens all the time. But I think the opposition and the civil society in Tanzania has an opportunity to keep speaking about those numbers, right? To keep speaking about the people that have died and to make it difficult for any leader to move as if it's business as usual. And I know people say a unity government will not work, but something has to give. And I'm a Zimbabwean, so maybe I'm more prone to thinking about, well, what can we get out of this? Because my fear is that if the opposition keeps pushing to abstain from elections, CCM is not going to abstain from elections. They will keep having elections and they will keep winning elections, right? And so I think abstaining from elections, which is a strategy that people have raised in Zimbabwe, I think it's a tricky one. I think it's a tricky one because when you give up elections, you give up a lot of ground. When we give up the opportunity for a government of national unity under the conditions that the opposition wants, right? So the opposition has to have its conditions that it wants. The mistake that the opposition in Zimbabwe did is that they got saddled with all the heavy ministries, right? So they did all the work in the Ministry of Finance, they did all the work in the Ministry of Education, and they helped propel the economy forward, but they were not able to credit claim. So the next election, ZANU-PF comes in sailing through as the opposition got conditioned to being in government. So there are ways to learn from the experiences of Kenya, to learn from the experiences of Zimbabwe, so that at least the lives that are lost, the 6,000 lives that are lost, it's not just in vain. Because I'm not sure, and the Tanzanians in the room, you seem more confident. But everything I know about these political parties, I'm not convinced that we will see a situation where Madam President steps down, CCM steps down, and the opposition takes over. So if I were speaking to the opposition and the civil society in Tanzania, I would say, what can you get out of this that leads to reform, that gives you a seat at the table, that gives Tanzanians a chance for a free and fair election? Either one that happens now. So this is something people should be demanding, a rerun, a re-election, something with reforms that allow opposition candidates to participate.
Thank you, Chipo. And you've said something that I totally agree with. There is no way, it's very difficult for someone to rule with so much blood spilled. It cannot be business as usual. Something has to be done. And this idea of rushing to closure that the CCM is trying to do is in vain. It's impossible. It can't work. But I think the opposition might have been right also to boycott elections, because the elections were just, the elections were more or less very ceremonial. You cannot, the commissioners are being chosen all by the president. You cannot contest presidential elections. I mean, it was just, they were justified so that they make a statement. But I agree with you, maybe in future, this is something to think about. But we've run out of time. I want to give you guys an opportunity to give your final thoughts, and for anything that we've not touched, you can just speak on it briefly, maybe 2 to 3 minutes each of you, and then I'll hand it over to James to close. We'll start with Constantine.
Yes, I mean, I just wanted to end by saying, there is scholarship. I mean, I completely agree with Chipo that this is not going to be a 100-meter dash. This is a marathon that we all have to prepare ourselves. It's unlikely that the CCM and Madam President are going to go out quietly. There are two kind of strands of scholarship that I want to leave people with that may be informative. One is a paper by the political scientist at the London School of Economics and Political Science, Dan DeCat, along with Evan Lieberman, the political scientist at MIT, who look at South Africa and wonder why there is this puzzling situation where it is exactly the residents of South Africa, the citizens of South Africa, who enjoy the most public goods and service provision by being urban dwellers, that are actually the ones that are the most fervent opposition South Africans. And as you've seen, the ANC for the first time in the most recent elections lost the majority and have had to organize a coalition government with the Democratic Alliance. This is certainly very true of the patterns you see in Tanzania, where it is precisely the places in these urban areas that enjoy this bus rapid transit system investment, for example, as Michaela spoke about, that are the ones who are the most fervent opposition leaders. In that paper, they talk very clearly about one of the mechanisms of how such governments and such ruling parties could respond. And one key concern of voters in South Africa, at least, with respect to the ANC, is the rampant corruption. This is certainly true of CCM's hold to power. Now, Magufuli briefly kind of tackled that kind of mechanism, because when you look at the Twaweza data, for instance, perception of corruption went down in the wake of Magufuli's election in 2015, suggesting that is one kind of channel that you can use to placate and appease the masses. The second piece of scholarship is by scholars who look at how such authoritarian leaders escape a country when things completely crumble and they're unable to have the loyalty of the army, the loyalty of the police forces, and they have to leave power. Almost certainly, any leader who experiences a coup, one of the most common outcomes is death for that leader. And so Samia and her very immediate clique, I'm sure, have considered Plan B and Plan C. And unfortunately, as I've commented to somebody's question in the chat, it suggests that, for example, the proximity she has with the United Arab Emirates, who are also being accused of financing incredible atrocities in the Sudan, may be one of the reasons that she's very defiant, and may be a potential outlet for her to exit into exile if it came down to it. I suspect Chipo and others are correct that the only way we will get meaningful change is if we have members of the elites of Tanzania within the ruling party to go against it. I have friends who I grew up with. I grew up very privileged, going to international schools in the region. And I can tell you that many of my young friends who are now millennials who've been elected in this sham election in October are doubling down. They're not trying to support the protest movement. And I suspect that as long as these powerful elites, both economic and political elites in Tanzania, as long as they're solidly behind the ruling party, it will make it very, very difficult for the opposition to dislodge them. You're muted, Duncan.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That is really brilliant. Tito, final thoughts.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for having me. Great interventions from fellow speakers, and as I always say, every thought has a place, especially if it makes if it lands where it's supposed to land. So for Tanzania's case, not only us in this call, but everyone was taken by surprise that, wow, we have never known Tanzania this way. So this comes from the fact that we have traded on this peace space for island narrative. Also forgetting the fact that we are descendants of Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, whose footprints are everywhere on the continent. So it was a miscalculation, or rather overlooking, the utility of what the descendants of Mwalimu can do in their own land. So for me, the Tanzania case must be looked at from a question of where do we meet the people, not about how do we negotiate power. Because it's not likely that there's actors who can negotiate power, because you have to negotiate from a point of strength. You don't. I told a group of elders this other week that the people will throw stones at you if you tell them about reconciliation, because they don't feel like you're representing them. We never sent you Hatuja Kutuma. At least we should also define that where can we meet the young people, or at least the people. I'm not young because I'm part of that group that demands for a better Tanzania, and I'm in my, I'm about grown the young age. So for me, I would look at a solution as being these people have people they trust. So in Swahili, I would say we have our own wazee that we trust. They can speak to us. But also we have our leaders, some are political leaders that we trust. At least no Tanzanians today would doubt Tundu Lissu's standing on matters governance, or doubt personalities like Mzee Jaji Warioba in matters governance. So there's always a way to meet the people and at least engage the people. The business as usual, or rather, solutions that have worked elsewhere, they might not necessarily work in Tanzania or Kenya or Zimbabwe, or the Madagascar way might not work. So I think there should be efforts, at least to decisively meet the people, not necessarily cut deals because it won't work, it won't be sustainable. This one I can assure. And if it happens like that, there's guaranteed continued resistance from all fronts of life. And it has to be borne in mind that we're 70 million population. So managing this population by propaganda, manipulation may not necessarily work. Asante sana.
Asante sana Tito, karibu. Michaela.
Thanks very much. That was really powerful from Tito just now. Maybe just 2 points. So one, kind of speaking to what Constantine was drawing in really helpfully in terms of important literature, and Chipo too, putting this in comparative perspective. I guess I might draw our attention also to a kind of urban politics literature to make sense of how CCM might respond with a range of strategies for re-establishing its urban political dominance. So those will be informal, formal, repressive, more co-optive. There's an excellent book, comparative book, looking across African and South Asian capital cities, Controlling the Capital, co-edited by Tom Goodfellow and David Jackman, which also looks at how, say, the EPRDF has responded in the context of Addis, which has also seen waves of major protest, which the regime has weathered. But if we want to make sense of CCM's response, I think we also need to kind of locate it in space and in cities and think about what that will entail. In her speech earlier today, again, President Samia stressed that Dar es Salaam, I mean, she was really bigging up Dar es Salaam, but this will also be true in Mwanza, Arusha, elsewhere. But, it is Tanzania, she called it. It is, a huge concentration of population, of investment, of government revenue, of, the symbolic image of the country to the outside. So the attention to these urban centers and the politics within them is going to be really important. And so drawing on that broader comparative literature that makes sense of how this plays out elsewhere will be important as well. But speaking to Tito, your point about meeting the people, I mean, I guess I'm not the one to say this. It's just speaking to friends in neighborhoods around Dar es Salaam. They are responding, and they are incredibly powerful with solidarity efforts, with attempts to help families who need to bury a 2-year-old caught in the crossfire, or who need additional financial support because they've had the small capital they were using for everyday street trading decimated by the period of lockdown. There is a lot of everyday kind of community organizing that is going on. And I was at a very powerful event last week with Shah Srinivasan from Cambridge University speaking about resistance committees in Sudan and stressing that model of kind of neighborhood coming together, a kind of revolution as something that is realized in the becoming in these communities, trying to imagine alternatives, critiquing the state, the government, but also kind of realizing alternatives in their kind of local areas and their neighborhoods. And I think there are aspects of that, where we celebrate the Sudan cases, we know those cases, but there are very much aspects of that happening in Dar es Salaam, and I'm sure cities elsewhere in Tanzania. And whether or not we get the large scale reforms, we will get that more everyday resistance.
Thanks, Michaela. Chipo, final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, final thoughts is first of all, I think it is important to recognize so that we don't seem like academics, some of us who are so far removed from the ground, that what happened in Tanzania is very heartbreaking, right? I think the region was slowly moving to a place where Zimbabwe was the only pariah state to some extent. And Tanzania has taken the region back, and this is concerning. But I do still want to urge the opposition, the activists, because the people is never a cohesive group. It's never a monolith, right? And sometimes that's where the struggle suffers. So really thinking through about who is we the people. Do the Gen Z protesters see the opposition parties the same way that millennial protesters see the opposition party? Do they want to be part of actual party politics, or is there something else that they're looking at? And what happens, we've all, I think with the exception of Constantine and Tito, myself included in this, we keep referring to Madam President. Madam President, there is something about how using those terms legitimizes the office, and over time, and we know this has happened in the world where we think something horrible has happened in country X and we expect change. But then 3 months go by, a year go by, 2 years go by, there is no change. And what has happened has become the new normal, right? So we need strong solidarities. I think something that our generation of Africans is missing is Pan-Africanism, right? We talk a lot about what the leaders of the past achieved, whether it's Nyerere or that generation, what they achieved. They were younger than us. Some of them, they were in their 20s, they were in their 30s, right? What is our generation's ideological contribution to what is happening on the continent? I really do think Larry Madow's work with CNN, and I know people see him differently in different circles, but that kind of using your voice. I mean, every progressive thinking African should be united in making sure that the Tanzanian government is uncomfortable with business as usual with 6,000 people dead. It should not be business as usual. But there's a very small window of opportunity to make sure that something is done before this does become business as usual. So.
Thank you, Chipo. That is really sobering. Small window of opportunity. Kazi kwenu, Constantine and Tito. Of course, as majirani, neighbors there, we are there to help you. And we've been there for you guys. I just want to thank you so much. Before I hand it over to James, I just want to say, I want to thank especially Constantine. When I reached out to you, you referred me to Michaela and Chipo. And, you guys have made a great team. I'd been in touch earlier with Tito, and, I just want to thank each of you individually for just sparing time. I know it's very late where Tito is, where Michaela is. It's really late, but we are looking forward to host you, Chipo, next spring. Constantine, please, we know you have a lot of friends here at Berkeley, but we really want next time, please come to the Center for African Studies. So thanks again, and really appreciate this. This has been very enriching. So it's being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube channel after a few weeks. It needs to be captioned and go through all those processes. So it will be there. But I just want to thank you. James, please.
Yeah, I'll just echoing Duncan. This was, I think Michaela used the word powerful, really powerful panel. I certainly learned a lot, and I know that people online, just the sense of what's going on the chat. There's an incredible conversation and talk going on, and I hope, I'm actually extremely pleased that we were able to kind of provide a forum for this kind of conversation. I hope more talking is kind of possible and that can be facilitated. And so I just want to thank Duncan for facilitating, directing our thoughts, putting this all together. Thank you so much, Duncan. You're amazing. And I just want to thank Michaela, Constantine, Tito, Chipo for this incredibly rich, multi-perspectival, sense of, and discussion and analysis of what's next for Tanzania. We're looking ahead, I guess, to December 9th. And I think you've given us an incredible frame and the kind of resources to be able to interpret what's happening in Tanzania. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And thank you to everyone online as well for being in the conversation. And I hope that it continues. Thank you all.
All right. All right. Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.